Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I will speak in English, even though my academic language is Spanish. First of all, I will put my main argument. So, climate change has led not only to environmental transformation, but also to political actions and policy responses, which have unequal implications according to gender, ethnicity, and territoriality. The global, national, local climate change policies generate different implications for local processes, especially for indigenous people around the world. I argue that it has been constructed an eco-governmentality based on the emergence of a notion of a carbonized nature that have sustained processes of production and reproduction of capitalocene. I rather prefer they use the notion, Haraway's and Moore's notion of capitalocene rather than anthropocene, based on extractive activities in which human relationships with the non-humans are erased. Similarly, ethnic and gender differences are blurred to make a way for a neutral citizen, a zero-carbon citizen, whose use of nature is mediated by new notions of valuation within the climate change carbon markets. To confront these processes, indigenous people have demanded recognition of their ways of thinking about climate environmental processes and their rights, based on concepts of territory, human and non-humans as kin, autonomy, and environmental self-determination, either proposal of environmental climate justice, which involves expanding our notions of environmental justice. Within this context, to address my argument, I will do the presentation focus on 4 points. The first one, we will explore the relationship of capitalocene with the new economic and extractive dynamics in Latin America. Then, in the second part, I will analyze the process linking to global climate change policies and the emergence of notion of carbonized nature and zero-carbon citizens. In the third part, I will analyze how indigenous people confront these based on their cultural strategies. Finally, I use the idea of indigenous people of the circulation of life in order to reconceptualize of environmental climate justice from indigenous people perspective. The capitalocene implies different scales, complexity, and processes of appropriation of nature, the environment or nature, because they use in a different way, is understood in relation to process, practices, policies, and representations associated with the non-humans as separate and under a modern or green capitalist idea of sustainability and economic valuation of nature, but at the same time, under the idea that parts of nature doesn't have the same valuation. Therefore, there are constructed a space for compensation, sacrifice, or use as a cheap natures. I use in the terms of Moore's about cheap natures. The capitalocene is related to extractivist processes that have led to an increase and intensification of exploitation, expulsion, and dispossession, with parallel process of deterritorialization, reterritorialization, and increase of inequalities between humans and non-humans due to conceptions that differentiate humans and non-humans based on binary notions of nature culture, and to the process of creation, appropriation, and globalization of natures. In Latin America, and for me it's important to relate climate change with extractivist processes, have been in place and the conquest and the colony, all the extractivist processes, and it implies a great number of relations and dynamics of exploitation, extraction, and transnationalization. These processes have in common new identity constructions of gender and ethnicity, transformations of the local global economic dynamics, new ways of produce knowledge about climate change, but about nature, about everything, change in relation with natures, internal and external process of territorial order, reconfiguration of the state policies, and armed conflict and violence. That implies also that the state and other political economical actors have changed conceptions of property, rights, and borders of local and transnational actors affecting indigenous rights and territories. Similarly, these scenarios overlap indigenous territories and allow multiple territorialities, with the resulting of control and ownership of land and resources by economic actors. These practices have shaped global environmental territorial superposition of territorialities, allowing transformation and policies related with that I call environmental scenarios of appropriation, expulsion, and dispossession. I will try to explain this idea. For me, climate change is not only related to problems and policies of climate change, but also with all the scenarios that I call it scenarios like biodiversity, mining, and agribusiness or monocrops, because they are related they are related with the global climate change because they share four ideas. One, the idea of fragmentation and valuation of nature. They share also the idea of identities and citizenship, even though each scenario constructs different kind of identity and citizenship. For example, biodiversity, countries are constructed like the best countries around biodiversity, but it's the same with mining. Also, another idea is rights and property and use. Because of the fragmentation and valuation of nature, it implies a new conception of property rights about part of nature or part of any function, especially with climate change. And there have another idea that is consumption and compensation. That means that all these scenarios are interrelated because all of them once consume and there are compensated. For example, in order to do mining for global climate change, for example, mining of lithium, there is spaces for biodiversity. For example, for mitigation and adaptation, REDD+ is supposed to be a very good option, but at the same time, there are monocrops and agribusiness to face climate change. Under this idea, these scenarios share two dimensions: time, because they could be simultaneous, synchronic, or alternatively; space, because they are codependent, co-producer, interrelated, and complementary. The scales are different and expansions are different, but they have in common that they try to face, even under the idea of sustainability, the global climate change, but at the same time, they are producing more expulsion and more dispossession. These scenarios are part of this idea of capitalocene. And these scenarios have in common is the connection with the national and international levels, and they share the idea of global environmental actions against climate change. In other words, is the emergence of an eco-governmentality of climate change that is articulated with specific geopolitics of representation of nature. It has focused on a particular rationality about nature under economic logic as a new global commodity. Moreover, they involve geopolitics of knowledge, which promote a single view of knowledge, which implies deterritorialization, territorialization, and decontextualization of knowledge surrounding climate, leading to the generation and maintenance of inequalities and exclusion. For example, indigenous people and women knowledge that are no part of the global policies related to climate change. Similarly, in order to reduce the impact of climate change mitigation and adaptation, actions are proposed, but there are no established agreements of opportunities for discussion with local communities of indigenous people, leaving other views of nature and climate, as well as their ways of relating these concepts according to gender. One example is, for example, REDD+. All these programs change the idea of nature for indigenous people and focus on trees, only on trees, and they change the ideas of territory, and they provoke unequal relationships with the peoples. In this context, relationships with the non-humans are erased to pose a notion of carbonized nature. Actually, in Spanish, it's naturaleza climatizada, but I don't find the word exactly, but carbonized nature is interesting. A carbonized nature is a specific notion of nature, fragmented, and its valuation is in terms of carbon markets. That implies a global territory related to subjectivities, identities, and practices within the global policies of climate change. Under this vision, for example, local forests are important to face climate change. However, the local territories are erased, and the relationships between humans and non-humans and their territory lose their cultural continuity and implies processes of appropriation or expulsion. Similarly, ethnic and gender differences are blurred to make a way for a neutral citizen, a zero-carbon citizen. For me, there is constructed some kind of idea of zero-carbon citizens, and everybody wants to be a zero-carbon citizen to face climate change. But this zero-carbon citizen, in policies and programs against climate change, women are only partially included. Indigenous people are not represented either, because these policies focus on the notion of zero carbon is a global citizen, deterritorialized, neutral, homogeneous, with zero carbon emissions and without ethnic, class, or gender identities. This global idea ignores difference and erases the need to see a specific perception, knowledge, and representations linked to gender or ethnicity impacts of climate change, and favors an homogeneous perspective of human population. The idea of zero-carbon citizen measures by its footprint of carbon emissions depoliticize the cause and consequences of the Capitalocene process. According to this, the zero-carbon citizen use of nature is mediated by new notions of valuation within the climate change carbon markets. These processes transform and reconfigure indigenous peoples' territorial, cultural identity and relationships with non-humans, as well as economic dynamics. Therefore, the conceptual, political, and territorial borders are in constant reconfiguration and affect demands of autonomy of indigenous people. This implies raising new demands of rights and cultural, territorial, and environmental confrontations that call for a cultural vision of environmental justice or climate justice, including humans and the non-humans, under their conceptions of ancestral law and justice. However, the responses of the territorial, environmental, and cultural reconfiguration are diverse and can arise around three processes. Interrelations arise when processes and relationships with new actors led to the emergence of new identities. In this context, autonomy is relational and allows some local decisions, but without option to confront these processes. The confrontations and collective resistance allow indigenous people demand environmental and climate justice in a struggle for the recognition of their rights and demanding action against socio-environmental inequalities. In these contentions, political arenas, indigenous strategies for climate and environmental justice have emerged. They confront the Capitalocene dynamics by proposing alternative forms of relationship with the non-humans in their territories, which focus on life itself and the right to be and live in their territories. Under relational ontology, thus, they are claiming for the recognition of the relationship between the territory and the non-humans under the vision of environmental, territorial, and political self-determination and cultural and political governability against the national and international attempts of appropriation by the global policies of climate change. There are also tied to particular knowledge and environmental management strategies and territorial control, as well as their own economic production. All this helps to position local knowledge and legitimize them as environmental authorities in collective territories. These alternatives are based on cultural principles. I will show the 5 cultural principles that most of the indigenous people in this moment in Colombia are trying to propose in order to face this climate change. One is the relational natures that implies how is their conception about the no-humans. The no-humans are kin, are relatives, and even part as a mineral or a rock are part of a living body. They are actants. They transmute and transform. Indigenous people maintain relations with the no-humans, which articulate territories and cultural practices according to notion of specific and localized beings. These relationships can be reciprocal between the human and no-humans, understood as a category that can include various beings as kin. Spatiality. The most important thing for me is territory. Territory. Everything happens in a space, but there are territories that imply vertical and horizontal geopolitics. The conceptions of indigenous people of territory and their territorial politics are conceived as a process of cultural and political relationships in which the territory is a living being, a social actor, capable of agency. Such territorial concepts that goes beyond land and soil involve various dimensions, spatial, physical, symbolical, and practices. In this sense, territorial projections that consider the fixed and the mobile arise, reflect in various scales, body, territory, nationality. Also, it is established a relationship between body and territory, which implies cultural dimensions of a specific place. In this place are identities, emotions, and belongings. All this led to local construction of a geographical being, live and be in the territory or dwelling within, as well as the processes of taking political decisions associated with size and other places of symbolical, cultural, and political importance. This means the control of the subsoil under the notion of territory, vertical indigenous territoriality, and indigenous altered geopolitics, including various notions and scales of territory, both horizontally and vertically. Another important part is how to rethink or how to think in another relations among men and women, gender categories. We see that climate change policies does not address gender relations only in the last 5 years. So indigenous proposals take into account the difference between men and women in the process of access, use, control, rights, and decision-making on the territorial and environmental practices in specific places according to gender representations and classifications. The other important part is politics, autonomy and self-determination. The territory is a political space and is the center of proposals regarding autonomy. It consists in being and exercise power, draw, territory, governability, and self-determination. Being autonomous involves vertical and horizontal territorial control on government and jurisdiction, environmental self-determination, food sovereignty, and demands for territorial collective rights and centralization of resistance and defense. The last important proposal is that they call life practices. The life practices is, according to this perspective, the territory and the no-humans enter into the ethic, political, and territorial dynamics of reciprocity as living entities. Therefore, the rise of being and existing allows the circulation of life. It's the life itself. This recognition arises from the local knowledge that are situated in specific territories and in a historical process. This idea of circulation of the life allows to rethink the environmental and climate justice, as well as the relationship of indigenous people and no-humans, needs to consider the economic, environmental, political, legal and cultural dimensions in local contexts and their interrelations with global local transformation. This could be based on indigenous cultural alternatives and political proposals to face climate change and the proposal of environmental climate justice. What is the idea? The idea is with these proposals of climate justice, they want to refrain or to rescind four processes, reversing inequalities. Inequalities that are based on the basic ideas of nature culture, on their modern idea of nature culture. The second one is rethinking global policies and environmental policies related to climate change, rethinking the political, the conceptual use, for example, adaptation, for example, or mitigation, all these ideas is the idea to rescind that, and practices exactly related to adaptation. In this regard, it is necessary to consider the ethical dimensions of the production of knowledge about climate change and its implications for environmental and climate justice. Indigenous people in the context of mitigation and adaptation policies cannot fully exercise their autonomy. The third idea is reframing national global rights. The idea there are human rights and rights of nature, but there has to be the recognition as rights for the territory and the all beings and the existence of, it means the life itself in a holistic perspective, and that includes the political dimensions of relationships between all beings, humans and non-humans, embedded in a territory. Finally, there is the inclusion of cultural dimensions, the difference around the world. Indigenous people have proposed strategies for locating within global policies the knowledge, identities, and territories and their difference. Their dynamical relationships with the non-humans have allowed them to be a start point for critiques of economic development and process of extractivism and its environmental implications. These dynamics have also generated indigenous proposals, focusing on processes that have been called in general living well, buen vivir, but also biocultural memory, politics of place and difference, or alter geopolitics of territory and knowledge. They are based on philosophical principles that become a collective proposal for organization of the territory and the life itself. That implies a new perspective of environmental climate justice. To rescind the capitalocene implies a process of climate justice in order to post local territories, specific locations, and localized knowledge according to historical process. In order to do that, I propose to arise from the idea of environmental self-determination that refers to indigenous notion of environmental justice that came from a sense of responsibility for humans and non-humans. In other words, there are other notions of beings, care, and rights of territory and non-humans. Therefore, they involve specific actions and practices in specific areas in coordination with various actors with overlapped territorialities. Thus, indigenous people propose an environmental justice based in other valuations and rights related to territory, cultural, and non-humans according to historical and situated processes. From indigenous territorial and cultural principles, alternatives to climate change should be understood as an ethical, political, territorial, and reciprocal actions within the territory and non-humans. That implies a rise from their identity and political dynamics, which includes all beings and the right to be and exist in relation to the non-humans. That allows the circulation of life that I call relational indigenous environmental justice. To close, in this way, the indigenous people confront the carbonized nature and the deterritorialized zero-carbon cities in order to relocate territories as alike, relational natures, and humans and non-humans as political beings and as relatives, and to propose alternatives to face climate change based on local knowledge and cultural processes. Thank you.